happiness is a bit comparable to health. Yeah, some people are born in a healthy body and, mostly they feel good. And so there are people who usually feel pretty happy. But that's not to say that they always will feel that way and that they cannot feel better. Why people in the West are pretty happy is that we have a lot of options to change. The best predictor of how happy people are in a nation is the quality of the bureaucracy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Mental Wellbeing Show. Today we have a mammoth episode. We have a pioneer in the well-being field joining us to discuss happiness myths and concepts. Professor Ruut Veenhoven is an Emeritus Professor of Happiness at the Erasmus University in the Netherlands. He is the Director of the World Database of Happiness, is a founding editor of the Journal of Happiness Studies, and is one of the world's most cited researchers in happiness. So in today's discussion, we dive into whether happiness is actually genetic, whether there's actually anything we can do to control and improve our happiness, or if it's bound to a set point, whether having a mental illness means you cannot be happy, and why wealthier countries are generally happier countries, amongst much, much more. This felt like an absolute privilege to have this discussion with someone who's impacted millions of lives through his research and has so much knowledge to share. And I really hope that you take away a lot of value from today's episode. If this episode or any of the other episodes do bring you value, please do hit subscribe or follow, as this is how I continue to grow the show. But now, over to today's discussion into happiness myths with Professor Ruut Veenhoven. Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental well-being. Each episode, we dive into the evidence with a global subject expert and break down the science into applicable strategies so you can take steps to improving your mental well-being. Professor Veenhoven, thank you so much for joining me on the Mental Wellbeing Show. It's an absolute privilege and honor to have you on the show. You've contributed so much to happiness and to well-being science. So I'm very grateful to be able to discuss these topics, happiness myths, happiness concepts with you. And before we dive into some of the myths and concepts, let's talk about what happiness is. So are you able to provide a bit of a definition as to what happiness is?
Well, happiness is a word with multiple meanings. In philosophy, it's a word for a good life, but in the social sciences, happiness is taken as satisfaction with life. How much you like the life you lead. Well, that's something that people have on their mind. You can just measure it by asking people.
And are there particular questions that you ask to get at what their levels of happiness are?
Yes, very simple. Taking all together, how satisfied or dissatisfied would you say you are with your life as a whole these days? If you're very dissatisfied, say 1. If you're most satisfied, say 10. It's a very simple question, and actually it's the definition of happiness. And because that question is so simple, it has been used in survey studies all over the world. And this question has been answered, by millions of people.
Someone who has researched heavily into this topic for decades, when you see this word happiness being thrown about and perhaps different definitions coming about and people making a profit of different definitions to suit their agendas, does that frustrate you? Does that what kind of feelings does that bring for you?
Yeah, well, in the social science, there's always a difference in terminology. And yes, and now that happiness is academically accepted, everybody calls his product happiness. Positive mental health is called eudaimonic happiness. And then, my variant, life satisfaction, is also denoted as hedonic happiness. Well, whatever the terminology, as long as you define it, it's okay.
Certainly a word that is thrown about a lot, both in science and self-help literature. And I think one of the real premises that people use happiness to perhaps sell an agenda or push an agenda is that happiness can be improved. And this kind of is what I'm touching at with the happiness set point. So the idea that the happiness set point theory holds that we have a certain baseline level of happiness that we kind of always come back to. Now, obviously, whether we have a happiness set point or not has big implications for researchers, for people trying to sell happiness books, etc. But you've looked into this. Is there such a thing as a set point, a baseline level of happiness that we always come back to no matter what?
No, I don't think so. Just go to hell, and and you will see that you can be less happy than you usually are. But still, happiness is a bit comparable to health. Yeah, some people are born in a healthy body, and mostly they feel good, and so there are people who usually feel pretty happy. But that's not to say that they always will feel that way and that they cannot feel better. And I think the set point theory. So if you if you have to score 5, well, you can be 6 one day and maybe 4 the next day. And now that's not true. Typically, you can improve yourself to a certain degree in the same way as you can, improve your health a bit by eating apples and doing exercise.
Yeah, that's as someone who's read plenty of self-help books and articles on how I can improve my happiness. It's good to know that I can actually make meaningful improvements there. So, what about the notion, Professor, of happiness being genetically predetermined? So, I hear a lot of this notion, I think particularly Sonia Lyubomirsky, that 40% or thereabouts of our happiness is genetically predetermined. Is there such a thing? How much of our happiness is determined by our genetics?
Yeah. Well, again, like health, and it is partly how your genetics are and your first experiences. And the estimate is that in countries, developed countries like the US, about 30% of the differences in happiness has a genetic basis. And that basis can be in your physics, in your body. It can also be in your mind. And it can also be in your personality. If you are, an extroverted type, then you do well in the US. You do less well in Japan. But still, extraversion is partly genetic. But this is in the conditions of a pretty livable society, the US. If you go to very bad conditions, you go to hell, well, then it doesn't really matter how your genes are. Everybody is unhappy there. But the better the living conditions are, the happier the people, but the more the differences in happiness become a matter of your life ability, which is partly genetic.
This was a really interesting idea and one I've never come across before reading through your articles. So, as I understand it, the better standard of living that you're in, or the better those social conditions, the more your genetic predisposition to happiness plays a role, as opposed to if you were to live in, say, a very developing country where social conditions are really, really abhorrent. Is that right?
Yeah, it's mainly the difference.
Okay.
If you live in a very livable environment, well, then all the conditions are good, but then still there are differences. Some people score 7, other people score 10. Well, and the better the conditions, the more that difference is a matter of your ability to your life ability, your art of living.
Yeah, okay, such a fascinating finding. Is that something that you came across through like twin studies or kind of, from a research point of view, how do you kind of look into and know these things? Because it seems, very specific, and I'm curious how you tease apart the genetic difference there.
Yeah. Well, the 30% I mentioned, and that is from twin studies, monogenetic, and what is the other? Uh, Genetic, and well, you can compare, and then this 30% pops up.
Another happiness kind of claim that gets popped about a lot, Professor, is this notion of the impact bias. So, for those who haven't heard of the impact bias, the idea that we project our expectations that certain events will have a really big impact on our happiness, whether that's increasing or decreasing. But the impact bias kind of holds that we have a bias, and really our happiness levels again don't really change too much depending on what the event is. And I think one that you've even critiqued a little bit is the Brickman 1971 claim of lotto winners, when their happiness goes up, it actually comes back down quite quickly, or so they claim. So, can you tell us a little bit about why that isn't really the case, and why happiness doesn't, adapt all the time?
So the idea is that, well, if you win a lottery, well, that's nice, and then you compare to other rich people, and then you go back. And the theory behind is that happiness is a matter of social comparison.
Mm.
And true, there is social comparison plays a role, but that's not everything. Actually, how happy we are is mostly determined by how happy we feel, and how happy we feel depends on the degree to which our innate needs are being gratified. Well, in our innate needs is we have a need for social respect, and so there is where the social comparison comes in. But we have more needs. We want companionship, we want food, we want sex, and all these things contribute to happiness.
So the social comparison idea that we compare our standards to that of others, and that if our standards improve, then our happiness doesn't improve as well, because then we just change the standards of comparison that we have. So, is that part of happiness at all, this comparison side of things? And do you see that happen more in, say, Western society or developed countries versus developing? Is there any differences there?
Yeah, well, social comparison plays a role,
Hmm.
but a small role.
Okay.
And what we typically know about the effect of social comparison is the satisfaction with income,
Hmm.
because you can see what the neighbors earn. Uh, but you see less well how happy the neighbors are. And the information basis is mostly from how you feel yourself. And so I would say, yes, social comparison plays a role, especially in particular ages, when you're young and looking for a position. Then social comparison plays a bigger role than when you're an old man like me.
Hmm.
Um, but your happiness depends on a lot of more things than how well you do compared to other people. Just when you have good friends, nice work, things like that.
Yeah, and you mentioned as well, Professor, this notion of innate needs. So, are there needs that are kind of cross-cultural and universal that you see, in Western and Eastern cultures, or are the needs that we have very culturally dependent?
When I speak about needs,
Mm.
it's universal, and the inclinations that have developed in evolution, such as, we are social animals, and so we want to have companionship. But like other social animals, we don't like to be at the bottom of the social ladder. Well, we have brains, so we like to use that. Well, and that is universal. And in each culture, people develop wants, but a want is not necessarily a need. You can want things you do not need, or you can even want things that go against your needs. For instance, Catholic priests who don't want to have sex. Well, clearly we have a need for sex, but they can want not to have sex. Yeah, of course, that's a sacrifice, and that makes you less happy. And so one of the tricks of happiness is finding out which ones really fit your needs. And that is something you, you find out in daily life. So you possibly you want to be academic, but sitting in the study all the time, you discover that's not really fitting your needs.
Yeah.
And then better you change your wants.
Yeah.
And that's easier if you do that yourself than when other people, for instance, your mother say what you should want. You should want to be an accountant. Yeah, maybe you're not the guy fitted for that profession.
Yeah, no, fascinating. This really relates to something that's happening in my own life. I'm leaving a particular job because I feel like my need for autonomy isn't a really good fit with the job. It's very constraining. There's not much, autonomy or way to express myself. This is a role as a psychologist. The treatment plans are all predefined. I don't get to make them. I don't get much scope or freedom to kind of individualize a treatment plan for a client. So my need for autonomy, I feel like, is not being met, and therefore I'm kind of changing that and taking steps to have that met. Are there ways that people can find out, or even like questionnaires, surveys, what their higher order needs are? I know that they're universal, but perhaps there are more individual variability as to which ones kind of have a preference, if you like, or a rank order.
No, I don't think that you can personally find out what the higher order needs are, but what you can experience is whether you feel good. And so in the case you mentioned in the job, well, that doesn't really fit. Well, and if you have the opportunity to change, you can do it. And I think one of the reasons why people in the West are pretty happy is that we have a lot of options to change. And there may be a cost to it, changing a job or changing a partner. But it helps us to, find out what fits us best. And that's why people in multiple choice societies, such as the US, tend to be happier than in, more traditional societies, take Saudi Arabia.
The freedom to choose and to have many options.
Yes. And the more freedom there is to choose, the more people come to live a life that fits them. But, there's one thing that there is freedom to choose. Well, then there must be something to choose. If there are no jobs at all for a psychologist, too bad. And there's also you need a capability to choose. And I think that is especially for students who enter adult life. And one of the things you develop during this time is a notion: who am I? What do I want? And typically, you don't know that by introspection. No, you learn it by experience, and then you develop an idea of who you are and what you want, and that helps to make choices.
It seems like from personal experience, it's the combination of introspection and experience. It's the doing and then the taking the time to reflect on how you feel, like you said, and then doing differently if you need to.
Yeah. But there's a lot of trial and error. But typically, when you're a student, you can do that. And when you have a steady job and a family, there's less trial left.
The consequences are greater when you've got 3 kids you need to be fed.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why people in their 30s get a bit less happy.
Okay, so they're less, understandably so, but less courageous to trial new things and get locked into certain patterns?
Typically they have learned what they want, but in the situation of a job and a family and a mortgage, your choices are more limited.
That's so interesting. It's certainly what I relate to right now. I am single. I do not have kids. I do not have a mortgage. I'm trying to trial things, to do high risk things, do a podcast, which brings in at the moment no income, for example.
Yeah.
But I know I can, and I know there's going to be a time when I have, the handcuffs of a mortgage, for example, which is going to, if I let it, limit my capabilities or my freedom to choose. Hello, everyone. Just a quick break from today's episode. If this discussion or any of the other episodes on the Mental Wellbeing Show have brought you value to your life or to the lives of the ones you love the most, I'd love it if you were to hit subscribe or follow, as this is how I continue to grow the show. Episodes are continuing to drop weekly on Wednesday evenings, Australia time. So hitting subscribe or follow allows you to get notified of these episodes. And I also do post daily shorts Monday to Friday on cool psychology experiments and mental well-being tips. So please do hit subscribe or follow. And now back to today's discussion with Professor Veenhoven. If we come back to this notion of impact bias and events that do change our well-being, what are some of the major life events that you see that do actually impact someone's happiness? So, for example, one thing that I know you've mentioned in your work is losing a spouse or having a spouse die. What are some of those major life events?
I don't think that it's just these events. Our life is more flowing, and then events happen. Okay, just the death of your spouse is a different thing. But getting your degree, getting the first job, these are things, little hallmarks, but not the things that really change it.
Okay.
There may be for particular people life-changing events, but typically we live in a flow, and on experience we choose either way or the other and try this and that.
Okay, so major life events or other, are there certain things, commonalities that you see that do impact happiness on a long-term scale, whether it's particular interventions like people who do a gratitude journal every week for years, or whether it is major life events? Are there certain kind of low-hanging fruit that people could tap into to improve their happiness?
Oh yeah, I said that in societies like the US, and the difference in happiness depends very much on your life ability. Well, a lot of people have mental problems, about 20% of the population. And we have a pretty well developed practice of psychotherapy and of life coaching. And I think if we use these resources, well, then typically you get better. Well, that is, you knock the door of a therapist, and when you think something is going wrong, you can also say, well, I have a good life. Say a 7. Could it be more? Well, I think then the exercises you'll find in positive psychology, so such as the gratitude exercise, can help. But also the How to Be Happy books.
Oh, yeah.
Not that you should do everything what is suggested there, but these How to Be Happy books are a bit like a travel guide. How could you live? If you go to Italy and you have the travel book, you don't visit all the churches, but it gives you an idea of what you could do in the holiday. And likewise, these How to Be Happy books, well, alert you to what you could do more with your life. And then there are also the techniques of happiness tracking. And actually, I have developed such an intervention. And there the trick is that you have a kind of happiness diary. And then typically it works on a website. And then the question is, well, how do you feel? And if you feel last month, well, suppose you say, well, I feel pretty good, 7 on a scale from 0 to 10. Well, then the question is that good or bad? Now, the trick is that in this intervention, you can compare with similar people, same age, education, sex, who have also used this tool. And if these people score on average 8, well, then you say, well, what is possible for most of these people, 8, should also be possible for me. And so you have the personal coaching, therapy, you have the books, and well, you have these tracking interventions. And well, and they all work. So my intervention well raises the happiness by some 5% on average.
What is your intervention? I know I've come across it, but the name is eluding me. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The happiness indicator. Happiness
Yes.
indicator on the web. Yes.
Okay, I'll
well,
put a link in it.
Yeah, and it indicates you how you could be happier. Well, and then the first question is, can I be happier at all? So if you score 8 and all people like you score 6, well, then you have the best possible happiness. But suppose you see, well, I'm less happy than comparable people. And then the happiness indicator has the so-called happiness diary. And in the happiness diary, you note what you did yesterday and how you felt. For instance, well, when the alarm clock went off, well, at what time was that? How did you feel when you had your breakfast? How did you feel? And again, well, then that provides an overview of how well you feel with most of the things you do. Where you really, how did you feel at work? And how did you feel with your girlfriend? And well, and that is that helps to get a better view on how you feel, because our memory of how we felt is typically focused on the highs and the lows, whereas for making choices, you need the average.
Okay, so we have a bias looking back as to just the extremes.
Yes, and so in this dairy technique, you get a better view on how you usually feel in most of the activities you do. Well, and that helps to make decisions. Well, it helps you to make a more informed choice on the basis of how you feel.
It seems like the magic in there is really that self-awareness and bringing into kind of some objective awareness with some ratings as to when you do and don't feel happy.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean that really ties into what we were saying before about introspect and then take action based on what you've learned about those reflections. So
yeah,
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 okay.
yeah.
Is that a free tool?
It's free. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, I'll certainly link it. Yeah, for people. And I've never done a consistent happiness self-monitoring kind of diary tracker like this. Is what do you recommend as a time frame to really get the most out of it? Is there a minimum dosage in terms of time frame?
Most people do it once or twice,
Mhm.
but and then typically they have a small gain, but the ones who use it, say, over a year every month, and that's typically the people who are the least happy and the most motivated to seek ways to feel better. Yes, and they profit most.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Yeah, we'll definitely be checking that one out, and I'll report back how I go with it.
Yeah.
And in terms of, you mentioned positive psychology interventions or PPIs as they're known. Are there particular other PPIs that stand out as really effective? Because this is like a really burgeoning kind of part of the literature now, as I'm seeing more and more and more PPIs put out in literature, things like gratitude, savoring, mindfulness, three good things, write or do a random act of kindness. But from what I understand, a lot of them are on, at least earlier in the 21st century, some shaky kind of foundations, empirically speaking. Are there ones that stand out with a stronger evidence base in terms of PPIs?
Not really. And I think it depends. Well, some people may really need meditation to bring down their stress, and yeah, other people who may be a bit egoistic maybe profit from thankfulness. And here we have a problem. If you go to in traditional psychotherapy, there is a diagnosis, and
Uh,
if you knock the door of a positive psychologist, you get one of these exercises,
mm,
and I think it's more difficult to give a diagnosis for people who have no mental problem, but
mm,
just think, well, I could be happier than I am. The six and the sevens,
yeah.
um, and yes, well, and then we give them all the medicine we have on the shelf.
Mm. Yeah, I love that point that you raised as well. And I think there's more and more awareness that uh, there are people without a mental illness who still can improve their mental health. This is that dual continua model of mental health. But just because you are having challenges with your mental health, or if you say to someone, mentally I'm not great or mentally I'm struggling, doesn't necessarily mean that there is a mental illness per se or a diagnosis per se, but there is still room to improve on your mental well-being or mental health.
Yeah, well, and that's where therapists and life coaches can
Mm.
help you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so fantastic to see that space more and more being recognized. I'm curious as well because that's just something I'm really, really passionate about. But I'm still finishing my master's professor in psychology and working as a junior psychologist. Uh, do you feel like this notion of mental health and mental well-being should be taught more to psychology students, and that the emphasis is still too much on uh, pathology and mental illness?
Yeah, well, I think people should know that anyway.
Mhm.
But yeah, in schools, well, in health education, we should also learn about let me say, the gray sides of mental disorders. But I think that we should convince people that there are mental problems just like there are physical problems. Well, if you have a physical problem, you have a headache, you go to the doctor, and typically it helps. Well, and in the same way for psychological problems. And even if we see it on the country level, then we can see that in countries where there are more psychologists per capita, people are happier.
Oh, okay. What kind of the variance does that account for? Is that quite a significant effect?
It's a very strong effect. And well, a good example is Costa Rica. Not a very rich country, but from their health budget, they spent relatively much on mental health care. And they're pretty happy. And there are countries where they hardly spend on mental health care, only in, severe psychiatric cases. Yes. And people are less happy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like, hey, if you have a country with a few doctors, well, people live shorter. If you have a country with less psychologists, people are less happy.
Yeah, it certainly makes intuitive sense. I'd never come across that in a paper, but yeah, that makes sense. That's good to know. And you mentioned the national side of things in terms of happiness. So we've talked a lot about individual happiness, and I'd certainly love to look at or discuss your work on happiness more at a national level. So one of the things I know you've commented a lot on, Professor, is the Easterlin paradox, which you can clean up my definition if you like, but as I understand it, is the idea that there actually aren't meaningful long-term relationships between the income of a nation and happiness. So Richard Easterlin, I think, kind of purported this, that when you look at it in the long term, there isn't much of a correlation between happiness and the GDP or GNP of a nation. So can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the Easterlin paradox, or the Easterlin illusion, as I know you termed it?
Yeah, because I disagree with Richard Easterlin since the 1970s when he advanced his paradox. And the paradox is that within countries, rich people are happier, but he claims that if you take the macro level of nations, in rich nations, they are not happier than in poor nations. Well, that is clearly not true because in the US, by the way, I can show it on the map. Then, yes, here it is.
You got a map.
Yeah. So, and here you see, if you go with the cursor, you see the average. So if you and you go to the US.
US, yep.
And so you see, well, and here you can see that, well, the darker the color, the happier the people. And typically, well, in developed nations like the US and in Western Europe, people are far happier than in poor Africa. If you go down, you see very low.
For African Republic, yeah. So this is the correlation between national income.
No. This is just the average. But indeed, there is a correlation. The richer the country, the happier the people. Okay, well, that was already clear in the 1970s. And then Richard Easterlin changed his argumentation. He said, no, but over time, there is no change. And he had a nice case of the US. Because, since the Second World War, Americans have become about twice as rich, and the happiness level has remained at the same level. And the same happened in Japan, where we have time series from 58 on, also flat on happiness.
Mm.
But it appears that these cases are the exceptions rather than the rule. And well, I'm still in discussion with Richard Easterlin, very gentlemanlike discussion. We agreed that in the end, the data will tell, and we get ever more data, and we get ever more longer time series. And well, I'm just finishing a paper now in which we see that, well, in most countries, there was economic growth, and in most countries, happiness has risen a bit. In some countries more than in others. But yes, in the countries where the economy grew most, happiness also tended to grow more. Which is not to say that there are exceptions, such as the US, but generally economic growth is accompanied by a rise in happiness, and which is actually part of a wider phenomenon, because economic growth is part of the modernization process. And this rising evidence that humans flourish better in the conditions of a modern, individualized society than in the more traditional collectivist society.
Yeah, okay. Because when the economic prosperity of a nation increases, so do many other things co-occur, right? So you see this. Yeah.
And something go good. Well, better technology, also better psychological technology, more freedom of choice, but also more difficulty to choose. And so modernization is not only good, it has its pros and its cons. But if you see the result over time, then there are more pros than cons. And in my view, human nature, as it developed in our hunter-gatherer forefathers, fits better with today's modern society than with yesterday's agricultural society of our grandparents.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And in terms of the America-Japan, exceptions to the rule, I've seen you speculate on this. Is there a bit of like a ceiling effect such that happy or richer countries perhaps don't see the same increases as poorer countries do? Like I think you compared as well Western Europe throughout World War II, because they had quite low levels of happiness. A lot of their financial resources were spent on the war. And then post World War II, you see quite, dramatic increases there, for example.
Yeah, I just checked, but I didn't see a clear difference between low-income countries and higher-income countries.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So it just overall, the general trend seems to be as the economic prosperity of a country increases, so too does the happiness.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So you also commented a lot, Professor, on some of those reasons. And I know you termed a number of factors as quality of society. I think you called it the rule of law, freedom, cultural plurality. These factors, along with the national product, account for about 80% of the variance.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about those factors and their importance?
Now, yeah, the big surprise was that the best predictor of how happy people are in a nation is the quality of the bureaucracy. Well, I would never have associated happiness with bureaucrats, but it's how it works. If you live in a country where the civil servants are well educated, they have a university education, and they are not corrupt, and there is little difference between the rules and the practice, well, then you have a predictable environment in which you can make your own choices. In economics, we know that in a well-organized society, you have less transaction costs, less risks, so you can produce Coca-Cola for a lower price.
Right.
And the same happens for us as individuals in finding a way of life that fits us. If we have a pretty predictable environment, and
Mm.
here also, well, state welfare also helps a bit.
Mm.
Well, then we are in a better position to find out which way of life fits us best. And then more people come to live a life that fits them.
In terms of these factors that influence happiness and happiness rankings, we see the Scandinavian countries in particular rank, in the top, 10, every year. I think the last one was Finland was number one. Mostly Australian and American audience that listen to this podcast. So I think the World Happiness Rankings, Australia was 12 and US was 15 for those Aussies and Americans listening. But is there a secret source, as Frank Martella terms it, to Scandinavian countries beyond what you've just mentioned? Is there anything they do better that we can learn from?
Well, they are rich. They are pretty individualistic. So in history, they were the first to adopt Protestantism.
Okay.
And they have a fairly well developed welfare states. Well, and that gives them a small advantage to other countries.
Yeah, and I've seen Frank Martella comment on this, but the welfare state seems important to me in terms of what we were discussing before about autonomy. If you have, the fallback of, for example, if you're unemployed, you have, a fallback of financial welfare to keep you going for a little while. You have a bit more autonomy and choice over the next job you take, over whether you're going to put up with the exploitation of your employment that you're experiencing. It gives you a bit more freedom to choose, again, to come back to what we're discussing.
Yeah. And of course, he also, the welfare state gives you also the freedom to choose to do nothing. Because every system has its pros and its cons. But yeah, typically you can make your choice and you do not become dependent on your family. And and that prevents that, your family takes over and it takes decisions that you wouldn't like. For instance, that they say, well, that is the right girl for you. And if you're economically independent, you can choose, yes, that's I like that girl. But if you're dependent on the family, well, yeah, they mingle in such life decisions.
It's fascinating looking at these rankings and speculating as to why they are what they are and countries are what they are. And I'll put the link below so people can check out their own nations wherever you're listening around the world, where your country does rank. I'm curious for yourself, Professor, in the Netherlands where you're based, what do you think would move the needle north in terms of national happiness for you guys? Although I know Netherlands is ranked very highly anyway.
If we look at how happiness developed in the Netherlands, the measurement started in the early 70s. Well, then the average was 7.2. Now it's 8.
Wow.
After a little COVID dip. And gradually the country has modernized further. We had, women emancipation. And we have, more awareness of mental problems. If I compare the 1970s with now, that's really a difference. And psychotherapy has developed. Well, it's a lot of these things which together add to somewhat greater happiness. Well, now we have an average of about 8.
Yeah.
I think the maximum will be about 8.5, because there's no country where the average will be 10, because no country can serve everybody.
Yeah.
And there is, inevitable misery in human lives. So if we might have an average of 8.5, that would be great.
No, and I think you mentioned women or female kind of emancipation, and that's something you've commented on as well. That seems to be correlated with better happiness in nations, isn't it? Is the freedom and autonomy of women, and how that's changed. You often see increases in happiness of nations as well.
Yes, but also here's things are more complicated than you might think. And so the more women emancipation, the higher the average happiness in the country.
Yeah.
But if you look over time, the guy seems to have profited more.
Okay.
If you compare from who gained the most happiness, then it's males, and among the women, especially among higher educated women who were in the forefront of the emancipation movement, they became less happy. Now the question is why?
Yeah.
One answer to the question is, well, emancipation is not finished yet. And women have the double burden. And okay, the guys do some nice things with the kids, but typically stick to their traditional role. Well, I think this is certainly, there's some truth in that explanation. But it's also possible, and that there is a natural difference, and that emancipation pushes women in typically male roles, and that fits less well. And when I look in my World Database of Happiness on the happiness of homemakers, I see that typically, also in the US, full-time homemakers are happier than typically working women.
Okay, an interesting difference there.
Yeah, and well, it's not everybody likes to hear that, and it's difficult to disentangle the cultural and the genetic things, but we shouldn't rule out that such a difference exists.
Yeah, I do wonder how that will be received, broadly speaking, by certain movements.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I didn't know that though. Well, look, Professor, as we come to the end of our discussion, I want to put one final question to you, and that is what do you hope to see is the next big frontier in happiness and well-being science? Where is the next place that we really need to look to increase and improve, the plight of humanity in terms of happiness and well-being?
Yeah, I think that we should forget about the one receipt that will apply to everybody. Okay. I think that how happy you are, it's the fit between your capabilities and the requirements of the environment. And that means that we must do continuous research on what adds to the happiness of whom. And so there are no typically in psychology, we tend to have general laws. No, there are no such laws. Actually, I think happiness research should rather give a map. Let me say, if you have a shallow sea with banks, and then the ships must know where they can go. and the sandbanks shift. Well, likewise, conditions in society shift. And the trick is to do research to see what are the conditions for happiness of highly educated people or for more practically educated people. And how does that work out? And actually, that is the object of my World Database of Happiness. Getting all that information, and on the basis of which you can see, well, what would work for me given the present knowledge.
This ties into your, I love, this is a bit of a tangent, but you have like a 3-step framework that to understanding what works for you, which is look at what works broadly for people, look at what works for people like you in terms of your age, gender, etc., and then do trial and error and iterate. So
and before you try, it's good to know how things have worked out for people like you, and that is what happiness research can provide. And what is in my World Database of Happiness.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I love that, almost personalizing it, figuring out what works for you. And in terms of a tool, I'll certainly link that database, the World Happiness Database. I had a look through it. I spent an hour or so on it, and I think I got through about 0.5% of what's on there. It's a very rich source of information. So I'll definitely link it for listeners.